She lost, and she refused to accept it. Before a single second of live NBA television aired, before the cameras at Madison Square Garden locked onto the main desk, before Carmelo Anthony leaned in with that look of quiet approval, before 4.5 million people tuned in to witness something a massive portion of the sports world said wasn't possible, Caitlin Clark was standing in a hallway losing a game of horse to Jamal Crawford. Nobody planned for a best of three. That's not how the segment was designed. The producers had a schedule, a rundown, a broadcast to prepare for. But Clark looked at them and said no. She wasn't walking out of that hallway with a loss on camera. So they ran it back, and she won. That moment, quiet, unscripted, unseen by the millions who would tune in minutes later, told you everything the critics have spent 2 years refusing to believe. This is not someone the spotlight found. This is someone who has been hunting the spotlight since before most people knew her name. And on February 1st, 2025, the spotlight didn't just find Caitlin Clark. It handed her a desk, a primetime slot, and the most important sports broadcast comeback in 23 years. What we're getting into today goes well beyond the highlight reel of her debut. We're connecting the corporate dots that most coverage completely ignores. We're unpacking the numbers the league didn't want to become the headline. And we're laying out exactly why NBC didn't just book Caitlin Clark for a cameo appearance. They built an entire strategy around her, one that was years in the making, rooted in a business structure that most casual fans have no idea exists. By the end of this, you won't just understand what happened on February 1st. You'll understand why it was always going to happen exactly this way. Let's start with the context, because without it, nothing else lands the way it should. NBC has not aired an NBA game since the 2002 finals. Think about what that actually means. Over 2 decades of silence on one of the most recognizable sports brands in American television history. 2 decades of watching ESPN and TNT and Amazon carve up the broadcast landscape while NBC sat on the outside. An entire generation of basketball fans grew up never once seeing the NBA on a Peacock network. The players who defined that NBC era, Kobe, Shaq, the end of the Jordan dynasty, those players are now coaches, analysts, and Hall of Famers doing guest spots on the very broadcast NBC is trying to rebuild. When NBC came back, they didn't tiptoe back in. They came back as the centerpiece of an 11-year, $76 billion media rights deal, the single largest media rights agreement in NBA history. That number is almost impossible to wrap your head around. $76 billion. That's not a network dipping its toe back into basketball. That's a full institutional commitment, a declaration that Sunday night basketball is not just returning, it is being rebuilt from the ground up as a flagship property. And when it came time to launch that investment, when NBC needed to send a signal to the entire sports media world that this wasn't nostalgia, that this was something new and serious and built for where the audience is right now, they didn't open with a Jordan retrospective. They didn't dust off the old NBA on NBC theme and coast on sentiment. They put Caitlin Clark at the main desk in prime time at Madison Square Garden. That is not a guest appearance. That is not a feel-good story. That is a declaration about what NBC believes the future of basketball broadcasting looks like. And the critics, who are always loudest right before they're proven wrong, came out swinging immediately. The criticism followed a very predictable pattern, and it's worth going through it because each piece of it reveals exactly how badly some people misread who Caitlin Clark actually is. She's too young. She has no broadcast experience. She hasn't earned a seat next to Hall of Famers. She's only there because of hype, not because of merit. You heard versions of all of it. And here's the thing. If you applied that framework to literally anyone else, it would be a reasonable set of questions. Broadcast credentials matter. Experience in front of a live national audience matters. The ability to hold your own next to Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, and Carmelo Anthony without wilting under the pressure of a debut that millions of people are specifically watching to see if you fail. That's not something you just show up and figure out. But here's what those critics consistently get wrong about Caitlin Clark. She is not new to this. During the NCAA Final Four, Clark did a Manning-cast-style alternate broadcast. You know what people said about it? Not that she was decent for someone her age, not that she showed promise for a first-timer. They said she was natural, insightful, genuinely compelling, the kind of television that makes you forget you're watching an alternate feed and not the main broadcast. She jumped into the Yankees broadcast booth and held her own alongside seasoned professionals who have been doing this for decades. She has been in front of cameras, microphones, and press rooms since she was in high school, and not once, not in a single moment that made the rounds online, did she ever look like she didn't belong exactly where she was.
But the thing the critics miss most completely isn't about broadcast credentials at all. It's about what Caitlin Clark actually brings to a basketball desk that nobody else on that set can replicate. Her basketball IQ is not surface level. It's not the kind of thing you can fake through preparation and bullet points. She reads defenses the way an elite quarterback reads coverages before the snap. She understands spacing, timing, passing lanes, and the geometry of the modern game with a level of sophistication that makes NBA coaches, actual NBA coaches, take notice when she talks. You are not getting recycled anecdotes from someone who played 15 years ago and has been living on reputation ever since. You are getting real-time analysis from an active elite athlete who runs the same offensive system, high-volume threes, pace and space, creative playmaking that defines the current NBA. That perspective cannot be manufactured. You cannot hire it, you cannot script it. And NBC understood it before the rest of the conversation even caught up to the idea. Now let's talk about the night itself, because NBC did not ease her in gently. February 1st, 6 in the evening Eastern Time, live from Madison Square Garden, the Lakers versus the Knicks, one of the most historically loaded matchups in professional basketball, at one of the most electrically charged arenas on the planet. LeBron James, potentially making his final appearance at MGS as a Laker, carrying the weight of a legacy that every single person in that building was acutely aware of. Jalen Brunson and a Knicks team fighting for positioning, for home court, for the kind of statement win that changes how a season gets remembered. Courtside seats were moving above $1,000 before tip-off. The building was at a level of anticipation that MGS reaches maybe 3 or 4 times a season. Bob Costas was there. Read that name again if you need to. Bob Costas, one of the most iconic sports broadcasters in American television history, returning to the property that defined a massive portion of his career. And then there's this. Michael Jordan made a special contributor appearance on that same broadcast. Let that sit for a second. The most celebrated player in NBA history, the man whose era NBC built its basketball identity around, the reason people still get emotional when they hear that old theme music. Michael Jordan showed up on the night NBC came back, and Caitlin Clark was on the same broadcast. That is not an accident. That is not a scheduling coincidence. When you are launching the most expensive sports rights deal in NBA history, and you are putting Michael Jordan and Caitlin Clark on the same night, you are making an unmistakable statement about past and future existing in the same frame. NBC knew exactly what they were doing. Every producer, every executive, every decision maker who signed off on that rundown knew what that juxtaposition was saying to the audience. The question that started circulating the second the broadcast ended was the obvious one. Did she actually hold her own? Clark joined host Maria Taylor at the Basketball Night in America desk alongside 3 Hall of Famers, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, and Carmelo Anthony. 3 of the most accomplished offensive players in NBA history. 3 men who combined for over 60,000 career points, multiple All-Star selections, Olympic gold medals, and decades of basketball at the highest level. That is not a forgiving panel for someone making their national primetime debut. She talked about the mystique of MGS and was candid enough to admit it was her first time at the Garden for a Knicks game, a moment of honesty that immediately made her feel real to viewers rather than scripted. She spoke about star players rising in high-pressure moments with the kind of specificity that comes from being someone who has lived that exact experience, not just observed it from a couch. And when she broke down elements of the game, the reads, the schemes, the decision-making at speed, the Hall of Famers beside her nodded. Not the polite nod you give someone you're being nice to on television, the nod you give when someone says something accurate, something you recognize, something that you know is right because you spent your career doing exactly what they're describing. Carmelo Anthony's reaction to her analysis became one of the most shared clips from the entire broadcast. That nod meant something. People who have played the game at the highest level do not hand that kind of validation out freely.
Sophie Cunningham, Clark's Indiana Fever teammate, watched the broadcast from home. She went on her podcast afterward and said Clark was a natural up there. Not good for her age, not impressive considering the circumstances. Natural. The same word people used after the NCAA alternate broadcast. When the same word keeps showing up from people who know her best, that's not a coincidence. That's a consistent truth. Then Aaliyah Boston, an NBC contributor herself for women's college basketball, a WNBA all-star, someone who competes at elite levels and has no reason to exaggerate, watched the broadcast and posted a simple question to Instagram. What can't you do? That is not fan reaction. That is not the kind of thing you get from someone who is easily impressed. That is a highly accomplished athlete watching someone they know personally perform at a level that genuinely surprised even the people closest to her. Then there are the numbers, and the numbers don't lie about what February 1st actually meant. 4.5 million viewers across NBC and Telemundo. Let's put that in context, because the raw number alone doesn't capture the significance. That was the most watched Sunday night regular season NBA game since 2002. Not the most watched debut, not the most watched comeback broadcast, not the most watched game of the month or the season. The most watched Sunday night regular season NBA game in 23 years. The Knicks won 112-100. The game itself delivered. The broadcast delivered around it. And the number on the other side confirms something that the skeptics had spent months insisting wasn't possible. That Caitlin Clark doesn't just draw an audience for women's basketball, she draws an audience, period. NBC president Rick Cordell was asked in the days following the broadcast whether fans could expect to see significantly more of Clark going forward. His answer was specific. He pointed to her relationship with Xfinity. He called her part of the family. He made it explicitly clear that February 1st was not a one-time experiment, not a calculated PR moment that would be quietly shelved after the ratings were logged. Her next scheduled appearance, March 29th in Oklahoma City, when the Thunder host the Knicks, was already confirmed and locked in. Part of the family. That phrase is where the real story lives. Because when Rick Cordell said it, he wasn't being warm and fuzzy for the cameras. He was describing a corporate structure that was already in place long before anyone at NBC sat down to plan the February 1st rundown. Here is what most of the coverage of Clark's NBC debut completely missed, or chose to gloss over, because it's more complicated than a feel-good story about a young athlete earning a seat at a big table. Caitlin Clark is signed with Xfinity as a brand ambassador. Xfinity is owned by Comcast. Comcast is the parent company of NBC. Read that chain one more time and let the implications settle. The athlete NBC chose to headline the comeback launch of their most important sports property in 2 decades is already under contract with a Comcast-owned brand. She was already inside the corporate family before a single camera at Madison Square Garden went live. This was not a talent search. This was not NBC executives watching her NCAA games and deciding she had potential. This was a coordinated alignment of business interests across one of the largest media conglomerates on the planet. NBC gets its biggest ratings draw in sports. Comcast activates its existing investment in Clark through its own broadcast network, amplifying the return on a deal that was already signed.
And Clark, at 22 years old, while still in the prime of her playing career, gains a platform that reaches tens of millions of people and begins building a media identity that will exist long after her last game as a professional basketball player. Think about what that means in terms of how athletes typically approach their careers. Most players spend 15 years playing, get to the end, and then scramble to figure out what the second chapter looks like. They reach out to networks, they do auditions, they try to translate what they know about the game into something that translates on television. And a lot of them never quite figure it out, because the gap between playing at an elite level and communicating what you know in a way that grips a television audience is wider than it looks. Caitlin Clark is not waiting for that chapter. She is writing it right now, in parallel with the playing career that makes everything else possible. Every strong moment on the NBC set creates new viewers who then follow her fever games. Every dominant performance on the court creates new demand for her voice in the broadcast booth. The two things are feeding each other in real time, building a flywheel of visibility and relevance that compounds every single week. At 22, with her best basketball still theoretically ahead of her.
That flywheel is already spinning fast, and the people at NBC, at Comcast, at Xfinity, and inside Clark's own camp are all watching it spin with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing the plan is working. But there is one more thread worth pulling on before this story is complete, and it is the thread that lit up every sneaker forum, every basketball media community, and every sports business analyst who was paying close attention in the days before the February 1st broadcast. NBC producer Sam Flood mentioned publicly in the lead-up to the show that they were hoping to have Clark with a basketball in her hand on set. That detail sounds small. It sounds like a production note about wanting to keep the broadcast feeling athletic and visual. But when you understand the context around it, that detail takes on an entirely different weight. Because the theory that was circulating with the most traction, the one that kept getting shared across sneaker communities and sports business accounts, was not that Clark was going to do a shooting demonstration for the cameras. It was not a three-point contest segment with Reggie Miller, entertaining as that would have been. The theory was that Caitlin Clark was planning to debut her Nike signature shoe live on national television at Madison Square Garden on the night NBC came back, on a broadcast that Michael Jordan was also appearing on. Nike has been conspicuously unusually quiet about the release timeline for Clark's signature shoe. A brand that markets every product launch with the kind of orchestrated buildup that gets people camping outside stores before sunrise has said almost nothing concrete about when the shoe drops, what it looks like, or how it will be positioned. That silence, in the context of what we know about how Nike operates, is itself a signal. It suggests that someone, somewhere, is holding the announcement for a specific moment, a moment with maximum impact, a moment that can't be replicated. Think about what that moment would have been. 4.5 million viewers, the most recognizable basketball arena in the world, a broadcast on which Michael Jordan, the man whose Air Jordans created the entire template for athlete signature footwear, is appearing as a special contributor. If Nike was looking for a launch pad that rivals the cultural weight of the original Air Jordan moment, that February 1st stage was the closest thing the current sports landscape could offer. Whether the shoe debut happened as planned or got pushed to a later date, the intention behind it tells you everything about how Nike is thinking about Caitlin Clark's commercial future. She is not a brand partnership. She is not an endorsement deal. She is a franchise, and Nike does not hold its breath waiting to announce a franchise player's shoe without a very good reason. What NBC constructed around Caitlin Clark on February 1st, 2025 was not a bet, it was a thesis, a well-researched, corporately supported, strategically timed thesis about where basketball media is heading and who gets to lead it there. The thesis goes something like this: the future of basketball broadcasting belongs to the athlete who makes the NBA and WNBA feel like one continuous conversation, rather than two separate sports in separate rooms with a wall between them.
The athlete who can sit next to Carmelo Anthony and earned that nod. The athlete who can pull 4.5 million Sunday night viewers while still being active on the court. The athlete who transcends the gender assumptions that have artificially limited how the sports world thinks about crossover appeal. The athlete who grew up watching basketball on television and now sits on the other side of that screen, rewriting what influence in this sport actually looks like. The ratings proved the thesis. The Hall of Famers sitting beside her confirmed it with every nod and every moment of genuine engagement. And a girl from Des Moines, Iowa, who refused to leave a hallway with a loss before the broadcast even started, is making the argument every time she opens her mouth on that set that the people who built this strategy around her were right. The story of how this broadcast relationship reshapes the WNBA's connection to the NBA heading into the 2026 season is still being written in real time. The Nike chapter isn't closed. The next NBC appearance is already on the calendar. The flywheel keeps spinning. And the critics who said she hadn't earned the seat are doing what critics always do when they get it wrong. They're getting very quiet, very fast. If you want to stay ahead of every move Clark makes, on the court and off it, in the broadcast booth and in the business world, make sure you're subscribed and have the bell turned on, because the next chapter of this story drops faster than people realize, and you don't want to be the last one to see it coming.